So welcome to the third in our series, What is Sovereignty? From the Bible to Charles III. It's lovely to see you all, and we're going to welcome Dr. Mike Gilbertson today, Archdeacon of Chester, and George will introduce him in a second. But meanwhile, I'd like to say the prayer I said before from this book, which is prayers linked with the coronation, and it's the first prayer, which is the prayer of servanthood. So let us pray. Lord Jesus Christ, you have taught us that what we do for the least of our brothers and sisters, we do also for you. Give us the will to be the servant of others as you were the servant of all, and gave up your life and died for us, but are alive and reign now and forever. Amen. So over to you, George.
Well, a warm welcome to everybody to this third talk in our series, A Talk with a Difference. And it's very good to welcome Mike Gilbertson, the Archdeacon of Chester, who came to the diocese in 2010 and shortly thereafter joined our team of Bible talkers. Mike has expertise in New Testament scholarship and has published a book in that area. So it's always good to have him as part of our team, though he does much in the Cathedral besides just being part of the Bible Talk series. It's especially good that on this day when the Cathedral is focusing on women, that the subject for today is Aethelflaed of Mercia, and we look forward to being enlightened, Mike, from Runcorn to Chester and beyond. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. Well, Aethelflaed of Mercia, it's very good to be with you this lunchtime, and thank you for that warm introduction. This is part of a series of talks that's been prompted by this being coronation year, I think. And it might be slightly tangential to some of the other talks which are in the series, but I hope it does fit in some way. And certainly in preparing it, I found this a really fascinating area of English history to engage with. And I hope that it encourages you to do more reading in this area as well. I want to start by taking us back almost exactly 1,050 years to Pentecost in the year 973. Pentecost 973. And I want to take you to Bath, at the minster at Bath, and for the coronation of King Edgar. The rite that was used for Edgar's coronation in 973 has come down to us in some detail through the writings of someone called Bertford of Ramsey. And I'm just going to go briefly through what we know happened that day so that you can notice some of the elements which we'll be expecting to see in the service for Charles III in May. Edgar was led into the minster by two bishops, and as he did so, the choir was singing words from Psalm 89, verses 14 and 15. Let thy hand be strengthened and thy right hand be exalted. They are the very same words that were set by Handel for the coronation of King George II, and are still used sometimes at coronations today. Edgar then prostrated himself before the altar. It was Archbishop Dunstan in those days, not Archbishop Justin. Archbishop Dunstan raised him up and chanted the Te Deum as he did so, and the Te Deum is sung at the coronations today. It was sung at Queen Elizabeth's coronation. And Edgar then made a threefold promise. And he said this: I promise in the first instance that the Church of God and the entire Christian populace shall, under my authority, keep true peace at all times. I also promise that I shall proscribe theft and all manner of wickedness for persons of all stations. And thirdly, that in all judgments I shall enjoin justice and mercy, so that our kind and merciful God shall grant his mercy to me and to you. A threefold promise, including a promise that he would ensure that the church kept true peace at all times. I don't know how quite you enforce that promise, especially as we are where the church is just at the moment. But it's interesting that the sovereign today still makes a promise. And going back to the coronation service in 1953, Elizabeth II made a promise to govern in peace and to protect the church. Edgar was then anointed while the choir sang Zadok the priest from 1 Kings chapter 1, not the version that we know by Handel, but still a setting of those same words. And then there was an important statement made to the king, beginning with the Latin sta et retine, meaning stand firm and assert. And that statement made to the king includes this statement, that the mediator between God and humankind, that is Jesus, confirms you, Edgar, as mediator between clergy and people on this throne of this realm, and allows you to rule with him in the eternal realm. And so there's a sense of the king being installed into a position where somehow he is representing Christ on earth. Edgar was then given a ring, a sword, he was crowned, he was blessed, given a rod and a scepter, similar symbols to what we will expect to see in the coronation service in May. And I just go briefly through that, partly to make a connection really between the coronation this year and all those years ago, over 1,000 years ago, 973 in Bath, the coronation of King Edgar, and a bit of an insight into what Anglo-Saxons might have thought about what was going on when a king was crowned. That sense of internal consecration to the role, but also an external display of authority. One slight oddity about this is that Edgar, by then, had already been King of Mercia for 16 years and King of England for 14 years. What on earth was he doing being crowned after he'd been king so long? It may actually have been the second or the third coronation that he went through. Maybe it was to give a sense of recognizing his kingship over the whole of the country in a way which he hadn't quite before. Some people have said that it was echoing the fact that he was around about 30 when he was crowned. Maybe that is making a connection with the age that Jesus was at the beginning of his public ministry. And of course, it was Pentecost, so the sense of being anointed with the Holy Spirit. Why, for whatever reason that Edgar did this in 973, straight after being crowned in Bath, he then sailed around the coast of Britain to Chester and spent some time being rowed up and down the River Dee by 6 under-kings from various parts of Britain to demonstrate his authority, his overlordship over them. Now, we know that the ritual that was used for Edgar in 973 goes back earlier. The elements of it go back earlier than that date, at least back into the 9th century and probably earlier, using elements from the continent and also, we think, rites that earlier Anglo-Saxon kings had used. Why am I starting off with that? It's just all a way of trying to connect this year and the coronation with the world, the very different world of Anglo-Saxon England, and also a way into thinking about this lady, Aethelflaed of Mercia. Aethelflaed was Edgar's great aunt, and she was someone who also had connections with Chester, as we will see. if you can see the slide that I've put up there, that is because of George's injunctions not to breach copyright. Most of the pictures that I'm showing you are pictures that I've taken myself, and so they haven't always come out brilliantly well. But that is one of the lights of the great west window in Chester Cathedral. It's the one on the far right of the window as you look at it from inside the cathedral. And you might just be able to see that at the top of the window it says Queen Aethelflaed. Queen Aethelflaed, a picture of Aethelflaed underneath. And then at the bottom of the picture, something I'll come on to in a minute. You'll see that the cathedral, that's a mid-20th century window by Carter Shapland. It denotes her as being Queen of Mercia, and down at the bottom of the picture you will see, you might just be able to see that she is sitting down on the right-hand side of the bottom of the picture, pointing at some plans of a fortification. And over the top of the at the top of the page, you can't see it, but it says Mercia. So it's making the link with what I'm going to come on to talk about. I think the figure standing next to her is her brother, King Edward the Elder. Interesting that the cathedral stained glass, as others have down the years, have called her Queen Aethelflaed. She was never actually a queen, and I'll explain that as I go along, but she certainly did exercise sovereignty in Anglo-Saxon England at a very pivotal point in our history, and was in many ways a very great leader. She was born about 870. She was the eldest child of Alfred the Great and his wife Aethelflaed, who was a Mercian princess. Her name, Aethelflaed, means noble beauty. Lots of people, if you look back on Anglo-Saxon family trees, lots of people have their names beginning with Ethel. Ethelbert, Aethelflaed, Ethelbald, Ethelwulf, Ethelred. And Ethel means noble, and Fled, the rest of her name, means beauty, beautiful. So she's noble and she's beautiful. She was born at the time of the Danish invasions of this country, a great struggle going on between Danes, people from the Scandinavia, not only from the west, from Ireland invading from the west, but particularly from the east. And if you know anything about the history of that period, you'll be able to picture a map of England, which I can't show you because of George's restrictions on copyright. I wasn't able to find one that did the job. But if you can imagine a map of England, I want you to imagine it in three parts. If you can imagine a line going down from Cheshire diagonally southeastwards to London. That's not difficult to imagine, is it? So from Chester down to London, northeast of that line, in the late 9th century, was basically controlled by the Danes. It was sometimes known as Danelaw. That was so the Danish invaders had possession of that part of England. From if you can imagine that line from England going down, from Cheshire going down to London, if you could sort of rotate that down to about the line of the River Thames, between there, those two lines, really the West Midlands and going down to London, was the area of the Kingdom of Mercia, and then below the line of the River Thames, essentially, the Kingdom of Wessex. So you had those three parts, the two Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Wessex and Mercia, and the Danes to the northeast of that first line I talked about. Aethelflaed, as the child of Alfred the Great, grew up in a learned court in Wessex. We know that her brother and sister were well educated, and we can assume that Aethelflaed was the same, reading theological and secular works as she grew up. There were various scholars around at Alfred's court, including somebody called Plegmund, who was a future Archbishop of Canterbury and has connections with this area as well. It is, according to legend, he lived as a hermit at Plumstall, near just up the road from Chester. What if you might know St. Peter's Plumstall, the church stuck in the field at Mickle Trafford. Well, originally that was a place called Plegmund's Stall, and so Plegmund is associated with that. It's said that he lived there several years as a hermit. As Aethelflaed grew up, she married someone called Aethelred of Mercia in the mid-1880s. So when she was in her mid-teens, Aethelred was a Mercian nobleman who had succeeded Ceolwulf II, who was the last king of Mercia, although Aethelred himself wasn't actually king. And because he wasn't king, because he recognized the overlordship of Alfred as King of Wessex. So he was known as an alderman, or the Lord of Mercia. And in fact, charters from Wessex from this period refer to him in Latin as a subregulus, or a kind of under king or under kinglet. So Aethelflaed herself is not actually a queen. So I'm afraid that the west window in Chester Cathedral is misleading. She was Lady of the Mercians. She was a great leader, but not actually a queen, although she came of royal stock, being Alfred's daughter. What we do know of Aethelflaed's life comes mostly from a version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle called the Mercian Register. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle exists in various different versions. The Mercian Register, which was produced, we think, more in the Midlands than the south of England, does mention Aethelflaed on a number of occasions. The version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that was produced in Wessex doesn't mention her. And that may be because of rivalry between Wessex and Mercia. We don't know, but we do have this information about her from the Mercian Register. And I'll refer to some of the things that we do know about her as we go along. Another source of information I'm trying to make this slide go on. There we go. Another source of information about Aethelflaed comes from charters that were granted by Aethelred and Aethelflaed jointly, and then later by Aethelflaed just by herself. Here's one, quite a well-known one, granted in 890 by Aethelflaed and Aethelred in the city of Worcester. Under this charter, they were authorizing the construction of something called a burh, B-U-R-H, at Worcester. Boroughs were fortified settlements on trade routes. Alfred had begun the program of building these boroughs as a defensive shield against Danish invasion. And as we'll see, Aethelflaed herself was hugely important in establishing these in different parts of the country. So the construction of the burh at Worcester for the protection of the inhabitants and also to enable the worship of God to be conducted safely. There were granting of privileges to the church, so financial privileges to the church in Worcester, and then an endowment to enable worship to take place in Worcester, really for the benefit of Aethelred and Aethelflaed. So it was agreed that, or it was commissioned, that the De Profundis, that's Psalm 130, out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord, would be sung during their lifetime, 3 times a day. And then after their death, Laudate Dominum, Psalm 117, Praise the Lord, all you nations, would be sung 3 times a day. And all the time, before they were dead and after they were dead, every Saturday, 30 psalms and a mass would be said. So what they were doing here was securing prayer for themselves in the long term in the setting of a religious community. And if you're familiar with our ideas of purgatory and so on, this is Aethelflaed and Aethelred securing prayer for them during this life and beyond death, so that prayer would be said for them, particularly while they were in purgatory. I had the good fortune to go to a school in Stockport Grammar School, just founded in 1487 by Sir Edmund Shah. He had something similar. He established a chantry requiring that De Profundis should be sung twice a week for him and for his parents. I'm afraid it's now only sung once a year on Founders' Day, and the school choir struggles through the De Profundis in Latin once a year. I can still remember bits of it, actually, but so it's not an uncommon pattern. Ethelred and Aethelflaed, ruling Mercia jointly as the Lord and Lady of Mercia, but not King and Queen, lead resistance against Danish incursions, founding boroughs. This is in collaboration later on with Aethelflaed's younger brother, Edward the Elder, another a child of Alfred the Great, who succeeds Alfred as King of Wessex in 899. And as the years go on, partnership between brother and sister, between Edward the Elder, King of Wessex, really with the overlord of both Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and Aethelflaed, his sister, ruling in Mercia, becomes really important in the fight against the Danish invaders. The Mercian Register tells us that in 907, Chester was restored, and this is often associated with Aethelflaed herself. Her husband Ethelred, Lord of Mercia, was still alive at that point, but his appearance in the records gets sparser and sparser as time goes on, and it's assumed that he might have had some sort of long-term illness, and eventually he disappears from the record when he and dies in 911. But this restoration of Chester is traditionally associated with Aethelflaed. Chester, as you will know, had been an important Roman centre, but it was in a state of disrepair, and Ethelred re-established it as one of these boroughs. What actually happened on the ground is not very clear, but it's been suggested that she extended the walls of Chester. If you can imagine, here again, I'm falling foul of the copyright rules, but so I can't show you a map, but if you can imagine what the Roman city of the Roman the fortified part of the Roman city would have looked like around the rectangular shape in the middle of Chester. It's thought that Aethelflaed arranged for the extension of the walls of Chester westward to the River Dee, from the northwest part of the Roman city across to the River Dee, past where the water tower, which is a later structure, where the water tower now is, to hit the river from that direction, and then going from the southeastern corner of the Roman walls south to the River Dee, past what is now Pepper Street, to the river at that point. Now, nothing is left of those defences. We think it was possibly a significant wooden fence that was put up, but that would have hugely expanded the area that was defended within this borough of Chester. We think also there is evidence that Aethelflaed also encouraged the churches in the city. Henry Bradshaw, writing in 1513, says that Aethelflaed enlarged the church which was already on the site of Chester Cathedral, and that it became a minster dedicated to Oswald and Werburgh. Now, this is all very murky. We don't really know whether that happened under Aethelflaed or not. Remember, Henry Bradshaw is writing about 500 years later, and we do know that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that in 909, Oswald's body, which had been under the control of the Danes, was transferred from Bardney in Lincolnshire into Mercia. Maybe that suggests that Aethelflaed had somehow got control of Oswald's relics and they were brought back into Mercia, but we don't know precisely what the relationship between Aethelflaed and Oswald and Werburgh, the memory of Oswald and Werburgh really was, but there are traditions which associate Aethelflaed with the re-establishment of that church and the cult of Oswald and Werburgh on that site. 911, Ethelred, Aethelflaed's husband, the Lord of Mercia, dies, and Aethelflaed begins to rule Mercia by herself as the Lady of Mercia. It's quite extraordinary. For 8 years, she basically ran Mercia herself, collaborating with her brother, Edward the Elder, the King of Wessex, and who also, by extension, was kind of king of, had overlordship of both kingdoms. The Mercian Register doesn't call her a queen, but it clearly sees her as a ruler and describes her actions in different places as with the help of God or with God's permission, echoing the way that a monarch's acts might be described. And it's clear that she was an exceptional leader. She was probably not wearing armor and leading troops into battle, but she does seem to have been a very significant strategic leader. And it's recorded that she established these boroughs, these fortified towns in a huge swathe of the country, in Bridgnorth, Tamworth, Stafford in 913. Here's the entry from the Mercian Register at that point. In this year, 913, by the grace of God, Aethelflaed, the Lady of the Mercians, went with all the Mercians to Tamworth and built the fortress there in the summer, and afterwards that at Stafford before Lammastide. She constructed a burh at Edisbury in Cheshire, though you may know Edisbury Hill overlooking the Delamere Forest. In Warwick, 915, a borough was established at Runcorn, almost certainly by Aethelflaed herself. Now, this is going back to those of you who are here before 1:10. I explained I've been creeping around Runcorn taking photos in order to dodge George's strictures about copyright. So here is a very strange sculpture of Aethelflaed on the promenade in Runcorn, overlooking the Manchester Ship Canal. This is Aethelflaed's face. There's a close-up. It's sort of part sculpture, part climbing frame. Not quite sure what it's doing there, except that it is looking towards Castle Rock in Runcorn, which is now underneath the southern end of the railway bridge, which is called the Queen Aethelflaeda Bridge, where we think the borough might have been. So Aethelflaed still standing guard over her borough in Runcorn. If you go to the theatre in Runcorn, to the Brindley Theatre, outside the theatre, this rather strange lump of rock, which is supposed to be Aethelflaed herself, and that was again put up relatively recently close to the river and has been moved up to the theatre for safekeeping. but if you're ever wandering past the Brindley Theatre in Runcorn, have a look at that rock. It doesn't actually say who it is, but it is supposed to be Aethelflaed. So from 915 in Runcorn, then 917, she established a borough in Derby, or at least she took the city of Derby. And it says, in this year before Lammas tide, Aethelflaed, the lady of the Mercians, won the borough called Derby with God's help, together with all the region which it controlled. And then 918, she went on to Leicester. So you can see she's sweeping through the Midlands of England, a quite remarkable military campaign. At that point, she was really at the height of her power, and York, the great city of York, agreed to submit to her. So she was really pushing back into the part of the country that had been overrun by the Danish armies. And this is what the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the Mercian Register of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, says in 918. And it's quite moving because this is recording Aethelflaed at the height of her powers and then her death in 918. In the early part of this year, with God's help, she secured possession of the borough of Leicester by peaceful means, and the majority of the Danish forces that owed allegiance to it became subject to her. The people of York had promised to accept her rule, but very soon after they had agreed to this, she died, 12 days before midsummer at Tamworth, and in the 8th year of her rule over Mercia as its rightful lord. She was buried at Gloucester in the East Chapel of St. Peter's Church. The obituary that is there for Aethelflaed in a different source called the Annals of Ulster, which is an Irish document which doesn't seem always to bear close relationship to what actually happened, but it does refer to Aethelflaed's death, and it refers to her as the most famous queen of the Saxons. Aethelflaed was succeeded as Lady of Mercia by her daughter, who at that point was not married, her daughter Aelfwine. And just taking a step back from that, it's quite a remarkable transfer of power from one woman to another, which I don't think happened in England again until 1558, between Mary I and Elizabeth I. Sadly, it only lasted a few months because these events are shrouded in obscurity a bit, but we know that Edward the Elder appeared in Mercia and took control of Mercia, and Aelfwine was taken back into Essex. We think that Aelfwine ended up in a nunnery somewhere, and Edward took over not only Wessex but Mercia, and so ruled both of those kingdoms. So what is Aethelflaed's legacy? I've said a bit about her life. As I've said as I've gone along, the figure of Aethelflaed is known to us through a few references in the Mercian Register, in a few Irish records, and in some later historians as well. We need to allow for the downplaying of her importance by contemporary records, partly because the main version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle we had was written in Wessex, and it was not in their interest to big up the achievements of the ruler of Mercia. Partly because, maybe because also that she was a woman. We don't know that, but maybe that was part of it as well. But clearly, she was a figure of great substance. And the Mercian Register refers almost casually to very significant strategic and political achievements that she made. It played a vital role in pushing back the Danish invasion of the east of England. And I think it's true to say that she was clearly exercising sovereignty over Mercia, even if she wasn't actually a queen. The Old English poem Judith, which is extant in one early 10th century manuscript in the same codex as Beowulf, very famous Old English poem, retells the story of Judith from the Apocrypha in the Bible. Remember, in the original story of Judith, who's a daring Jewish widow, she ingratiates herself with the Assyrian commander Holofernes, who is leading an attack on the Jewish people. She gets access to his tent, decapitates him, and the Assyrians flee. The Old English poem, a retelling of the story, makes Judith more of a military figure. And it changes the story so that Judith displays Holofernes' head to the Hebrew army and leads them to victory over the Assyrians. And that poem, in one way or another, has been associated with the memory of Aethelflaed. Writing around 1000, so a few years after Aethelflaed's death, the abbot Elfric writes about Judith, the story in the Apocrypha primarily. He says this: Judith, the widow who overcame Holofernes, the Syrian chief, has her own book. That's the book in the Apocrypha. But then he says, concerning her own victory, besides, the book is set in English in our manner as a model to you men, that you protect your country with weapons against the attacking multitude. So Judith, the apocryphal, the heroine from the Apocrypha, is being used as a symbol of military might in the present, in the around the year 1000. And it's often thought by scholars, there's quite a lot of literature about this, that the memory of Aethelflaed influenced the writing of that poem, or at least the way in which that poem was understood. And maybe Elfric, who was writing not so long after Aethelflaed's death, was making that connection himself, although he doesn't mention her specifically. Aethelflaed's memory lived on, and I'm going to finish with just referring to two 12th century historians. One, William of Malmesbury, who it was a point of curiosity to William that, quote, a woman should be able to protect men at home and to intimidate them abroad. That was his assessment of Aethelflaed. And then another 12th century historian, Henry of Huntingdon, in his great work, the Historia Anglorum, he was clearly fascinated, slightly obsessed with Aethelflaed, in an admiring way, but also in a slightly sexist and patronizing way as well. I'm going to finish with a quote from Henry of Huntingdon. He calls her Aethelflaeda, which is a different rendering of her name. Heroic Aethelflaeda, great in martial fame, a man in valor, woman though in name. Thee warlike hosts, thee nature too obeyed, conqueror over both, though born by sex a maid. Changed be thy name, such honour triumphs bring, a queen by title, but indeed a king. Heroes before the Mercian heroine quailed, Caesar himself to win such glory failed. So there's a fascinated, slightly sexist Henry of Huntingdon, translated in rather gushing Victorian prose to finish the talk.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. A real insight into things little known, but fascinating, especially in the way in which you've incorporated references to various biblical texts along the way.
Yes, I didn't realize it was a Bible talk, George, and I was sort of desperately
Well, not least the Book of Judith, which is
Yes.
Fascinating also in the Reformation period, in the way in which it is used to support minority nationalisms, particularly in Reformation Germany, in the German states, against Catholicism. The little person who's able to quell the big army, but particularly pertinent when, of course, it's a woman who is the little person. But here the strong lady for sure. So we have a few moments for some questions, if anybody would like to ask something. Jeff, please.
I'll unmute. This is a sort of a could be a red herring, but I was intrigued when you were reading through the coronation in 973, and just reflecting on the fact, as we're aware, from time to time there are murmurings about disestablishing the Church of England, and it just struck me, what effect would that have on the coronation if the Church of England was no longer the established church? I imagine it would have to be an entirely different ceremony without the archbishops, etc., playing their role.
I'm sure you're right, Jeff. I think there'll be quite a lot of people watching the coronation in May this year who might end up being quite surprised at how religious a ceremony it is. And we're very different. I mean, the relationship between the crown and the church in 973 was quite different from what it is today, but it's still obviously very profound. And I was again intrigued by the way that so many elements of that service 1050 years ago are the same as what we would have today, even down to the anthems that the choir is singing. And there's a huge tradition there and a huge interweaving of church and state. You're quite right. I don't know what on earth a coronation would look like if the church was not involved in it. That's a good point.
Yeah. Thank you.
Jezza.
I've got a question to ask about this dear lady. Can you hear?
Yes.
Oh, good. I can hear an excellent background. Yeah. What was her personality like?
Well, the difficulty is that we don't really know. We can only deduce that or infer that from these quite scant references in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. I think before we opened up the screen at 1:10 and people were talking beforehand, there was some discussion of the way that Aethelflaed has become a character in recent historical fiction, particularly a series of novels called The Last Kingdom. A lot of the characters that appear in that are purely fictional, and there's a lot of deduction or inference going on about what Aethelflaed might have been like. Really, all we know is are these quite short entries in chronicles from the time, which simply say, she did this, she did that. By God's grace, she established this. And I suppose from reading that and from understanding a little bit about the historical context, we can assume that she must have been a very resourceful and strategic and impressive leader. But in terms of her kind of personal character, I'm afraid we don't have access to what she might have been like or what she might have looked like.
I wanted to ask you about Judith as well. why wasn't Judith, the book of Judith in the Bible, when we've certainly got the story of Jael, and she took a man's head in Judges.
Well, I really hesitate to pronounce on that when we've got Philip and Loveday and George in the room. I think any one of those is far better equipped to answer that question than I am. So I don't know whether any of them wants to come in on that.
Well, it's partly to do with the likely date of its authorship, which is probably in the 1st century BC. And those books that end up in the Hebrew Bible, eventually the Old Testament, tend to be a little bit older than that, or much older than that. But of course, Judith is in some Christian Bibles. She's in the Roman Catholic Bible. So she's just there as in the Apocrypha in Protestant Bibles.
Thank you.
I wonder, Mike.
Sorry, George.
I wonder whether the research done for the west window in the cathedral didn't depend upon the Ulster Chronicle that you referred to, where you seem to quote it as saying that she was a queen.
Yes, it did refer to her as the Queen of the Saxons. There are some very interesting entries in some of the Irish writing of that time. Another document called the Fragment of the Annals of Ireland, it gives a description. We're not quite sure when this was, but somewhere in the early 10th century, an amazing description of a battle or a siege at Chester. We don't know whether this was a description of something that Aethelflaed was involved in or not, but there's an extraordinary description of a Viking army outside the city walls, with various things being poured down on it by the defenders, boiling beer at one point, and they put hurdles over their heads, the Vikings, to try to protect themselves from this boiling beer, and put hides over, and then the defenders throw beehives down onto these. Eventually, the siege is lifted. But whether that's an accurate description of what actually happened around the year 907, we just don't know. But it's interesting to compare the very kind of matter-of-fact entries in the Mercian register of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle with some of these more colourful records, and also some of the things from later historians and later traditions. And of course, one thing that we have heard over the last few days actually is that some of these traditions which live on can sometimes turn out to be true. So there was a long-standing tradition, centuries old, in Leicester, that the church, which is now Leicester Cathedral, was built on the site of a Roman temple. And archaeologists have just, it's just been publicized over the last few days that they have actually found that was the case. So some of the old traditions about Aethelflaed and Chester, for example, that the Bone Oswald Thorn Tower near the water tower is named after one of her commanders. I didn't mention that, but it might be true. We just don't know.
Well, thank you for a fascinating lunchtime hour. We're very grateful to you indeed, Mike. So next week we continue with Loveday Alexander, who's going to look, amongst other things, at some issues emerging out of Romans 13. So do join us next week. Thank you again, Mike. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.